friends, I'm the Reverend Terry Peterson, minister of St. John's in Gourig. Today is the 4th of December, the second Sunday of Advent. And this is a wee sermon extra for you because my Esther notes not only fill up this page, but go on to another page as well. And that's too much for a Sunday morning. So I thought we'd have a wee chat about some of the more interesting things that I have notes about. The first of those things I want to talk about is actually about the book of Esther as a whole. Esther's only 10 chapters long. It's not a very long book. You can go and read it in half an hour, 45 minutes maybe. It's very fast-paced. A lot happens, but it's quick. There's a lot of action, and all that action is like in a short space of time and a small geographic location for the most part, which is interesting because it's set in the Persian Empire. Now, Persia was the empire that took over from the Babylonians. So after Babylon had defeated Assyria, I know this is so much history, Assyria took over the northern kingdom of Israel and deported all the people, well, not all, but deported many of the people and destroyed a lot of things. And then Babylon took over from Assyria, and they did the same in the southern kingdom. So they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and they took away the political leaders, the religious leaders, the economic leaders, and the artisans, the people who made both culture and sort of products that you could use, like, say, weapons or everyday life things. They left the peasants, but they took everyone sort of important and put them in other places around the empire so that there wouldn't be critical mass of any one people in any one place to try to mount a rebellion. The Persian Empire arose and conquered Babylon, and the Persian Empire then stretched at its height from what we now know as Iran all the way down to Sudan. It's a huge empire, and the largest the world had seen up to that point, both in landmass and in people. And they had similar practices, but they also reversed some of the previous ones. So, for instance, the Bible describes King Cyrus of Persia as God's anointed one anointed for the task of sending the Israelites from Babylon back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and like supporting that with his money. So a whole cadre of people returned, or in some cases went to Jerusalem for the first time because it had been about 70 years. So we're talking about new generations of people who'd been born in Babylon, returned to their ancestral home in Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the temple there, much smaller than Solomon's temple, but nonetheless a good size religious building, and they began to sort of rebuild a Jewish life there. In other parts of the Persian Empire, the conquered peoples were so assimilated that it didn't really make sense for them to go back, and so they just continued to be assimilated. So relatively speaking, it was a fairly diverse place, this empire. Not in the way we would consider diversity today, because obviously in every place, those conquered peoples were still a minority, but they were not necessarily separate. And you can see that in the way that Haman talks about the Jews when he complains about them to the king. So they've obviously had enough sort of integration that Esther is passing as Persian. They don't know that she's Jewish, despite the fact that she spent a year in the harem before becoming queen. They don't know that she's Jewish. So she must look and sound Persian enough, and she never uses her Hebrew name, which is Hadassah. She uses her Persian name, Esther, which is based on the name of the goddess Ishtar, right? So she's got that going for her, but Haman talks about the Jews to the king as if they are people who are just in the midst of everything. Like, they're just regular neighbors, but they follow different customs. Now, he tries to say they don't follow the king's laws, which is not true. They just have additional religious laws that they would follow, or dietary laws that they would follow, but they would still be following the law of the land as well. But he's trying to look for a reason to get rid of them, of course. Now, The other thing you would want to know, besides how the Persian Empire worked, is that Esther is most likely, like almost all the scholars I have read say that Esther is most likely a short story. It's not a history or a set of facts or like a chronicle of the kings of Persia. There's no historical evidence that there was a Jewish queen in Persia. There's no historical evidence that there was a massacre of Jews planned within the empire, nor any evidence that there was another decree made that the Jews could fight back and that they ended up slaughtering a bunch of people, which is what happens if you keep reading. The reason that happens is because according to Jewish sort of tropes about Persians, so you see this in Esther and in Daniel, the Persian kings, when they make a decree, that decree is irrevocable. You can't change it. So in order to counter it, you have to make another decree that basically says, it can't even say, oh, just undo that. It has to like offer a balance. So when the decree is written that says people are supposed to kill all the Jews on this day, then there's another decree that comes out at the end of the story that says, if anyone tries to kill the Jews, they can kill them instead. So that's how they try to balance that. That's a terrible way to run an empire, particularly an empire of that size. Try to imagine what would happen if every time a law was made, it could never be changed or it could never be revoked. Like, that's ridiculous. And the idea of that is part of the way that Jewish literature talks about the Persian Empire, but there's no evidence that it actually ran that way. In fact, they're known for being quite an efficient empire, actually, with fairly decent governance as far as ancient world empires go. So, among other things, and those are some pieces of evidence that it's a story that's meant to do something other than tell a history of what happened. Another small piece of evidence is that there are two queens in the story. Vashti, we don't know how long she was queen before she was deposed, but probably a few years at least. And then Esther, who'd been queen 5 years already by the time we get to today's part of the story in chapter 4. And there are no royal children mentioned. There are no heirs talked about. And like we all know that in every royal story, that's the main thing. Like everybody wants to know like who's going to take the throne next, but there's zero care for what happens to that here. And some of that is because the king, who is probably meant to be portraying King Xerxes, but he's named King Ahasuerus, he clearly does not have interest in governing his empire. He's a party king. He throws that 6-month-long party. Again, no evidence of that, but it's a convenient way to begin the story. He throws this 6-month-long debauched party that would put any sort of films to shame, really. And then he just he's not interested in anything. So for instance, when Mordecai comes through the city and he's trying to reach Esther to talk to her about this decree that has been made about the extermination of the Jews, he reaches the gates of the palace complex and is not allowed to go any farther because he is wearing sackcloth and ashes mourning clothes. He's torn his regular clothes and he's in these clothes of grief and distress. And the king doesn't allow signs of grief and distress inside the palace complex. He only allows things that are fun and funny and joyous and happy and lighthearted. So throughout the book, you can see him drinking a lot, eating a lot, and holding these parties that allow for what appears to be quite a lot of things that are not kid-friendly discussion, shall we say. And then he doesn't allow anything else. If it's about real life or distress or drama, he doesn't want it. So Mordecai has to stay at the gate because he refuses to let go of that distress and mourning just to get inside. He's not going to paper over the horror that is happening to his people. So instead, he stands there in the city square in his sackcloth and ashes, wailing and trying to bring attention to this problem. So that, I think, is a fascinating little tidbit and insight into the king. The next thing that I want to bring up about this particular chapter is that Mordecai had previously told Esther not to reveal her Jewishness. But then when he cannot get into the gate and he has to communicate with her through a messenger, then he tells that messenger to tell Esther that her people are in danger. So now the messenger knows the truth about Esther because of that exchange. So in some sense, she's begun to be outed. She's passing as Persian. She must look Persian enough, and she must not have any form of accent. I mean, obviously, her family has been in Persia for some time, most likely. The Israelite exile had already been going on for 70 years, so it's probable that her parents and maybe even grandparents had been born in exile, depending on how old she is at this point. And Mordecai is her older cousin, like cousin but the next generation, so he's old enough to be her uncle, but they're first cousins. But he has taken her in as his own daughter because her parents have died. So he's advising her, but then he's the one who sort of breaks the rule on what he had told her to do. And that seems to be the kind of turning point moment for Esther. Up to this point, she had done everything that she was told. So she was taken to the harem as part of this beauty contest. Beauty in air quotes for sure, because everybody spent a night with the king after this, so we know what kind of contest this was. And while she was there, she followed Mordecai's instructions. She didn't reveal who she was, but then she also followed the eunuch's instructions to the letter, so that when it was her time to go to the king, she just took whatever the head eunuch person advised. Like, she didn't ask for anything herself. She just did exactly what she was told. She was a very sort of pliant, reliable, we might call her responsible and, obedient, all those things that girls are trained to be. But this moment, when Mordecai breaks his own rule to her, is the one when she begins to sort of turn. So at first, she reminds Mordecai that the rule is that you can't just go and talk to the king. If you turn up in his presence and he doesn't want to see you, you're dead. But if he raises his golden scepter, the actual word says golden rod, and you should probably raise an eyebrow when you think about this. If he doesn't raise his golden scepter, then you die. But if he does, then you get to come in. Like, again, what a ridiculous way to run a kingdom, right? But Mordecai doesn't really care about the rules anymore. And Esther knows that because he's already broken the major number one rule, which is don't tell that you're a Jew. And so from that moment is when she learns to say, all right, if I perish, I perish. And she actually becomes the one giving the orders. Did you notice it in today's reading? Esther said to Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and then I'll go to the king. And it says, Mordecai went away and did everything Esther had ordered him. And from that moment, it's Esther who's calling the shots in this story. Now, thankfully, when she gets to the king, he does in fact raise the golden scepter, and she invites him to a banquet, along with Haman. And then while they're at the banquet, she plies him with drink and with food, and it's all very lovely, and he's willing to give her anything, and she says, come to another banquet tomorrow. And so he does. Haman and the king come to another banquet tomorrow, and it's there that she reveals the situation. And the king does exactly what she asks, which is, well, first she asks, of course, for the decree to be reversed, but it can't. apparently. So instead, he does exactly what she asks, which is to allow her people to fight back. But then, when that day comes, then this fascinating thing happens where she goes to the king again, and he raises the scepter, and she has another request, and she gets right to the point, that could the people who are in the city have an extra day? And they do get an extra day. And lots of people think that's to explain why some places have a 1-day festival and some places have a 2-day festival. But it's fascinating that she just begins to take charge of everything. And then it's like, oh, what should we do for Mordecai? And she's like, what about giving him Haman's house? And what should we do with Haman? How about if you impale him on the same spike he had planned for Mordecai? And then he starts asking her, what should we do? And she's ready. She's got everything ready for what should happen next. And it's her direction that turns the whole story upside down. Isn't that so interesting? That in the moment when she really didn't have much choice because she recognized that the danger was already at her doorstep, she just embraced this power that she didn't know that she had. And that's what made a big difference in everything. I think it's so amazing. Now, the last thing I want to say about this book today, I want to say a lot of things, but the last thing I want to say today, and this is relevant all the time, but I think particularly at this time of year, is that Esther is a book that never once mentions the name of God. God is not in this book in the usual way. God's not talked about. God isn't named. God's not invoked. And the closest we get to any sort of spiritual practice is that experience of fasting that Esther asks the people to do for her, which normally would be a sort of way of entreating God for something, but it doesn't say that. So in some ways it reads as if it's an act of solidarity that connects Esther inside the palace with the people outside the palace, but it could be read as about God. And some people, Jews in particular, read God in the part where Mordecai says, if you keep silent, then relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, it says. And some people read the another quarter to mean God, as if Esther does something, then God doesn't mean to do anything, but if Esther does nothing, God will have to step in, which I think is a strange reading. But in any case, the Hebrew version of this book never mentions God. Now, why would we have in the middle of the Bible, like it's just before the Psalms, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, that's where you'll find it if you want to go read it. Why would we have in the middle of the Bible this short story that isn't history and isn't about God? Now, obviously, we can say with some certainty, all certainty, that God is in the story, but as subtext, right? God's presence is implied in the story. But do we think that just because it's a story about Jews? Do we think that because it's a story that's in the Bible? Do we think that because we recognize that's true of everything in the world, that even if we don't see explicitly God's presence or God's name, that we know God is still present? So the reason I think this is important for us is because if we read this story in the middle of a collection of short stories by other authors, if you had Flannery O'Connor and O. Henry and Shakespeare or whatever, if you had these short stories all together in a book and you just read it that way, not in the Bible, would you think this was a story about God and God's action through people, God saving the people by empowering one person to speak on behalf of them? No, I don't think you would. What matters here is the context in which we read it, because that story comes in the middle of what we think of as our holy book. it feels to us like a holy book. So basically, it's because of how we approach the scripture, and this book counts as scripture, because we're approaching it that way, we see God in it, even though God is never mentioned. Now think about that and apply it to other stories, films, music, television, books. They may not mention God, but that entirely depends ultimately on how we approach it. Do I watch that film as if it's going to tell me something about God's action in the lives of the people who are in it? Do I approach that song as if it is going to offer me a way to connect to God? Do I approach that random novel about a talking cat as if it can teach me something about how to be God's people in the world? How we approach the story ultimately determines what we see in the story. And because we approach Esther as scripture, we see it as a story about God. Now apply that to Christmas time, because there are so many shenanigans going on with the media stories we see at Christmas time, right? The films, the songs, the parties, the lights, the everything, like all of that, on the one hand, we know is meant to help us enter into the coming of Christ in the world. But for a lot of people, it's just like fluffy, fun, whatever, holiday magic. But how we approach it matters. If we think that there is a way that God can speak to us through that thing, then God will speak to us through that thing. And if we think there is no God in it, then we won't see any God in it. So I hope that that is something that we will consider as we go through this season and every season, but this one in particular, when the Christian story is like right below the surface of all that stuff, right? The story of Emmanuel, God with us, God taking on flesh and living with human beings, which is mind-blowing. That story that changes the world is right below the surface of everything in this season. And we could be the ones to choose to bring it into the open. But that will depend on how we approach it, and what we see in it depends on what we approach it, how we approach it, what our mindset is. Are we looking for the coming of Christ in all of that silliness as well as in the serious stuff? Or will we miss it? So that's a lot of things. You can see why it doesn't all fit in a sermon. I still have about 47 more things, which is why a sermon series might be coming next year. We'll see, or a Bible study series or something. But in the meantime, I hope that you have some new things to think about in the rest of this Advent season from Esther, and that you maybe are interested enough to go and read her story and to keep your eyes open for how God is speaking in all sorts of stories. So I think that's all for today. Until next time, peace be with you.